Mr. Speaker, it is said that the numbers never lie, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, they themselves are quite incapable of doing so. Mr. Speaker, we are here today to debate the appropriation bill for 2017-18 in respect of expenditure of the Consolidated Fund for Recurrent Expenditure and also that for the Improvement Development Fund for Projects and Equipment. The process as envisaged by our Constitution and the Public Finance Audit and Control Act is simple enough. The government presents its entire estimates of income and expenditure and borrowing, and Parliament then decides if that is prudent or not. Mr. Speaker, this of course assumes that Parliament is in possession of all the correct numbers and all the necessary facts to arrive at an informed decision. Mr. Speaker, the ideal position is quite simply a break-even budget or one that delivers a surplus of income over expenditure. Prudence is the overall objective, so that we do not overextend ourselves as a nation as regards debt levels and maintain a buffer for the future, which Mr. Bolsano is so fond of. No more, Mr. Speaker, and no less than we would all responsibly do at an individual level, and expect that we would all want to do collectively as a community. Mr. Speaker, I have said before that the rules in respect of public finance may be either incorrectly implemented, outdated, or simply being cheated in their interpretation. And I stand by that assertion. I summarize that view in the Gibraltar Chronicle in an opinion piece as follows. I have found that the Public Finance Audit and Control Act, together with the Public Finance Borrowing Powers Act, are being neatly sidestepped by the wholesale use of companies owned by the government and outside the remit of the principal auditor. Our public finances can now be likened to an iceberg, whereby what you see above the surface and reported in the annual estimates of revenue and expenditure is but a fraction of that which is concealed below a multitude of companies and devices. Mr. Speaker, I have to echo the sentiments expressed by my learned friend, the Leader of the Opposition, and state now that I cannot and will not support this, or indeed any future appropriation bill presented by this government where Parliament does not have all the necessary facts and figures required to arrive at an informed decision. Mr. Speaker, it is disrespectful to this Parliament and disrespectful to the people of Gibraltar not to have all the necessary information required. Mr. Speaker, I have 4 areas in which I wish to address in respect of public finances, namely artificial income, direct and indirect debt, scrutiny and management of public finances and government-owned companies, and advanced budget measures, forecast outturn, and the cost of living. And Mr. Speaker, I will also touch upon other areas of my portfolio, including the Gibraltar Savings Bank, inwards investment, heritage, small businesses, and financial services. So, Mr. Speaker, looking at our public finances, on artificial income, Mr. Speaker, having now had the benefit of sitting in this House for over a year, I have found methods whereby the government can flatter its income by the use of transactions with its own companies and other entities it controls, such as the Gibraltar Savings Bank. I've identified the following 3 types of what we would call related party transactions that generate or save cash for the government account, with no underlying private sector economic activity. And those are in the areas of stamp duty, property sales and the savings bank purchase or funding of public assets. Mr. Speaker, the government is today reporting a forecast consolidated fund surplus of £17.8 million for the financial year ended 2016-17, and a cash balance of 122 million or 122.8 million. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me show how easily that surplus can be undone by reversing some of these types of transactions. Stamp duty, as an example. Mr. Speaker, under the Stamp Duty Act, all conveyances of property in Gibraltar by companies, including government-owned companies, are subject to the payment of stamp duty at the prescribed rate. Mr. Speaker, through searches conducted at the Land Registry, I've identified various large, or certainly at least 4 large, transactions between government-owned companies which merely switch direct ownership, but nevertheless generate substantial stamp duty revenue. The first one, Mr. Speaker, GCP Investments, a government-owned company, on the 1st of July 2014 sold 14 government properties, including, Mr. Speaker, number 6 Convent Place and the Main Street Post Office, to GAR Limited, or GAR Limited, another government company, for a combined value of £14,292,975.159. The total stamp duty paid was £1.4 million. The government's explanation for this transaction was given simply as rationalisation. Mr. Speaker, the second transaction. Gibraltar Land Holdings sold, yes, sold the East Side Reclamation, again to GAR Limited, another government-owned company, on the 22nd of May 2014 for the grand total sum of £75,469.680, and this generated 2.6 million in stamp duty for the government. The third transaction, Mr. Speaker, was between Gibraltar Air Terminal Limited and Gibraltar Land Holdings Limited and the Crown on the 20th of May 2013, whereby Gibraltar Air Terminal Limited surrendered its existing lease to the Crown, and then Gibraltar Land Holdings purchased the air terminal for, Mr. Speaker, £90 million, and then gave a lease back to Air Terminal Limited for 20 years at an annual rental of £5.4 million. Mr. Speaker, this then miraculously generates a stamp duty of £3.3 million and revenue to the government on the sale of property of £90 million. Mr. Speaker, in answer to questions, the government has stated that the amount of stamp duty receipts in respect of such related party transactions for the financial year 2014-15 was £7.1 million. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the financial year 2016-17, we know that the government earned an exceptional amount of approximately £14 million from the sale of the 6 housing estates, which were sold for a consideration of £397 million from Gibraltar Residential Properties Limited to Gibraltar Capital Assets Limited. Now that, Mr. Speaker, is usually ungenerously called, in accounting terms, manufactured income, since it arose from the government's own financing transaction between 2 government-owned companies, i.e. with itself. So, Mr. Speaker, from this we can determine that the government was, in 2014-15 and 2016-17, able to create artificial stamp duty income of at least £21 million into the consolidated fund. And these are purely from transactions originated and directed by itself, and not from independent economic activity in the private sector. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, only last week, the Honourable Mr. Bolsano confirmed that these transactions had no economic effect other than to create revenue in government books while creating an opposite expense in the books of government companies. They should, of course, cancel each other out, but they don't. It flatters the revenue of the government and extracts cash from government companies. Mr. Speaker, I move on now to the question of property sales. Mr. Speaker, within the Improvements and Development Fund, there's overhead 102 in respect of government property sales. Mr. Speaker, I, as indeed any ordinary citizen, would reasonably expect that these are to third parties. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've already identified one transaction in respect to the airport that moved 90 million from government-owned companies in 2014 onto the government's books. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in answer to questions in this House, we have been told by the government that receipts from property sales to government-owned companies have been 90 million in 2012-13, 37.1 million in 13-14, and 26.4 million in 15-16. Mr. Speaker, that is a total of 153.5 million of related party property sales prior to this financial year. Mr. Speaker, and in addition, the principal auditor revealed in his report for 14-15 that GAR Limited, the mysterious GAR Limited, had purchased the mount, of all things, from the government for consideration of 8.2 million in 14-15, and the proceeds were paid into the General Sinking Fund, of which I am so fond. Now, Mr. Speaker, unless all this property has been sold on to the private sector by those government-owned companies, all that has happened is that the government has extracted cash from its own companies and replaced it with property in the books of those companies while recording a sale in its books. Now let me move on to the other type of transaction. The savings bank purchasing or funding of public assets. Mr. Speaker, this government is in the habit of making announcements in which it is taking a financial interest, only for us later to find out that it's been structured differently. So the government actually doesn't bear the direct financial burden. Take, Mr. Speaker, for example, the announcement in November 2014 that Her Majesty's Government of Gibraltar was going to buy back Telecom Slovenia's 50% shareholding in Gib Telecom for consideration of 47.7 million euros, or effectively 37.8 million pounds. Mr. Speaker, subsequent to the event, it was found that the 50% shareholding representing the B shares were in fact bought by the savings bank and not the government. And Mr. Speaker, we now know that the remaining 50% representing the A shares were also bought, this time from the government directly, by the savings bank, prior to a general election, for a further £37.8 million, making the total purchase value by the savings bank of £75.6 million, which of course benefited the government's financial position. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the savings bank via subsidiary GSBA Limited purchased the North and South District post offices, as well as a Treasury building in Main Street. Mr. Speaker, by way of example, in last year's budget speech, the Chief Minister proudly announced that, in respect to the LNG plant will be operated by Shell, whose presence in Gibraltar will be through a 51% subsidiary aptly named Shell LNG Gibraltar Limited. In order to reduce the overall cost of this contract of its 20-year life to the Gibraltar taxpayer, the government, note, will own the remaining 49% of the shares, ensuring government shares the economic benefits of this arrangement. The total cost of this facility is circa $144 million over a period of 2 years. At the end of the 20-year contract, the plant will revert to full government ownership for a nominal payment. The government, mark you. Mr. Speaker, a Companies House search conducted on Shell LNG Gibraltar Limited revealed that it is not in fact owned 49% by the government, but by Credit Finance Company Limited instead. So of the 35 million total cost, its share, the 17 million, will not be funded by the government, but de facto the Gibraltar Savings Bank via Credit Finance. And so, Mr. Speaker, the government has thus, from the examples I've listed, benefited by £92.6 million due to the savings bank's largesse in purchasing government assets or taking on its obligations. Mr. Speaker, this together with the other types of transactions I've identified brings the running total to £246.1 million, which if reversed would wipe out not just this year's projected surplus of £75.8 million, but also the entire combined cash balances of the Consolidated Improvement Development Funds of £122.9 million, and theoretically leave us in a loss-making position. Mr. Speaker, but of course, the government could borrow to replace the money as used. But this is where the financial alchemy of turning deficits into surpluses comes into being by the use of the 400 million in Credit Finance Company Limited. And now, of course, we have the extra 300 million in Gibraltar Capital Assets Limited. It is here, Mr. Speaker, where the government's interpretation of the rules on public finance and borrowing by government-owned companies utterly fails the smell test. Mr. Speaker, let me move on to discuss the government's direct and indirect debt. Mr. Speaker, the official gross direct debt of the government is £447.7 million, or £319.8 million net, which is made up of £247.7 million of debentures held by the savings bank, by the way, with no fixed maturity, and £200 million of bank borrowing. The bank borrowing has provided £50 million by NatWest, maturing in March 2020, and £150 million by Barclays, maturing in two tranches, one of £100 million in January 2019, and the remaining £50 million in June 2020. I heard the Chief Minister remark this morning that the Financial Secretary would be looking to extend the maturity date of direct government debt, and I assume he means the bank debt. And of course, we can only welcome the Financial Secretary's efforts in ensuring these facilities are rolled over. But, Mr. Speaker, of course, this was pretty much the gross debt position in December 2011, which stood at 519.8 million gross, or 234 million net, with the exception that the debentures in issue were 319 million held by pensioners and the general public. Mr. Speaker, it is well known that the government asked pensioners to swap their government debentures for savings bank debentures, and we have already in this place debated whether the savings bank's liabilities are contingent liability and or should not be accounted for in the government's books as occurs in the UK for national savings and investments. But, Mr. Speaker, for now, that is not the point I wish to make. In the creation of Credit Finance and the savings bank then making a 400 million investment into it via preference shares, it effectively created a backdoor, a funding method for government companies that could borrow for projects or buy assets from the government as described earlier. Mr. Speaker, Gibraltar Investment Holdings has borrowed at least 330 million from Credit Finance at a cost of 6.5% per annum, or £21 million a year. And incidentally, Mr. Speaker, I cannot find any recent financial information in respect of Credit Finance on the government's website. The last information I've seen was updated in July 2016, and certainly there's nothing in respect of 2017. And Mr. Speaker, this is where the catch-all of pooling of the cash of the government and its company comes into play. The government now, via Treasury, effectively acts as banker to its companies, taking deposits and giving loans, but none of it considered an official debt to the government. We have seen, Mr. Speaker, how in the past projects were funded by the government via the Improvement and Development Fund. And that is the amount that the Consolidated Fund has to give to projects, and that has dropped dramatically since 2011. Projects, we hear, are now funded directly by the companies using cash from this now famous pool, provided, of course, in the main by credit finance. Mr. Speaker, we can be sure, absolutely sure, that without the creation of credit finance and the use of this 400 million from the savings bank, the government would have had to borrow that amount for itself to fund its many capital projects since 2011. So, Mr. Speaker, we know what the direct debt is. It's in the book. So let's start a tally of what we shall call indirect debt. Start with credit finance. 400 million effectively borrowed from the savings bank. Call it preference shares, call it what you want. GCP Investments Limited, 17.1 million borrowed from Barclays Bank, secured on government property, including the City Hall. ES Limited, 55 million from Lombard PLC, secured for the construction of a new power station. And now, of course, Mr. Speaker, Gibraltar Capital Assets Limited, 300 million loan notes secured on 6 public housing estates. Mr. Speaker, that adds up to 772 million, in addition to the official gross debt of 447.7 million. And that would take us, Mr. Speaker, to a gross debt level of 1.2 billion pounds, or a net debt, if you wish, of at least 100 million, as at the 31st of March 2017. Mr. Speaker, total liquid reserves, which included the cash held by government companies, fell by 160 million from 294 million as of the 31st of March 2014 to 134 million as at the 31st of March 2015. Mr. Speaker, that is an enormous drop in cash in 1 year. Mr. Speaker, it is now evident to me that prior to the last general election, the government's available cash position was in fact much worse than we could possibly have imagined. It is no wonder that the government thought it would be a good idea to change our net debt legal borrowing limit in early 2016 from 80% of recurrent revenue to 40% of GDP. It is also evident, Mr. Speaker, that the government must have known it needed to borrow more money. And it was dishonest to suggest in its manifesto that it would actually reduce debt levels. Mr. Speaker, we have heard a lot in this House about Gibraltar Capital Assets Limited. I don't think that anyone can be any doubt, other than, of course, the Chief Minister himself, that this 300 million borrowed by mortgaging 6 housing estates is a debt of Gibraltar, all of us, and repayable by Gibraltar, all of us. And this is not an investment, it's a borrowing. And Mr. Speaker, we still do not know the terms of the option agreement by which the loan note holders may sell their interest to the government. And the government refuses to provide the opposition with a copy of the private placement memorandum setting out the terms of those loan notes. But, Mr. Speaker, we do know that the notes mature in 5 tranches over 31 years with a composite rate of 3.85%. Tranche A of 35 million at a rate of 3.31%. The first 15 years matures in 2031. Tranche B, another 30 million at a rate of 3.67%. A 20-year note matures in 2036. Tranche C, 38 million at a rate of 3.81%. A 25-year loan note maturing in 2041. Tranche D, £105 million at 3.98%, a 30-year note, matures in, again, 2046. And finally, Mr. Speaker, Tranche E, £92 million at a rate of 3.98%, a 31-year note, matures in 2047. Now, Mr. Speaker, in that period, we will need to pay interest, and this is just the interest, of £341 million, in addition to the repayment of a loan amount. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister likes to refer to this money now as his war chest. And yet, since the budget last year, we've not heard of a single project that will generate an economic return, despite it costing us, just this year, £11 million in interest payments. We've only heard today, Mr. Speaker, of some idea of an involvement in a coaling island reclamation to generate some economic return. Mr. Speaker, the rental income of a housing estate mortgaged will only come at the most to £3 million. It does not cover the interest cost. And this has had to be made up by the government by an £8 million housing allowance, which is paid by another government-owned company, which we were told only last week is in fact the company that sold the estates in the first place. If this makes sense to anybody listening, please explain it to me. So, Mr. Speaker, when the Chief Minister claims that the government's direct debt is falling, let's not forget that he is loaded up on indirect debt at almost twice the amount. Now, Mr. Speaker, what worries me is that we don't seem to have any plan as to how we will pay all of this. The General Sinking Fund, which Mr. Lozano correctly points out, was created in November 2012, only has a balance of £5 million in it, as at the 31st of March 2017. And from what I gather, there is no set formula to set aside money into it to provide for repayment of even the £447 million of direct gross debt, let alone indirect debt. Mr. Speaker, we really do need a debt management plan. So, Mr. Speaker, looking at the scrutiny and management of public finances and government-owned companies, the Chief Minister is only too fond of boasting that his government is the most transparent, and that now having 10 meetings a year, we in the opposition can ask as many questions as we like, and there's no need for any further scrutiny of our public finances. Well, Mr. Speaker, you'll be delighted to hear that I will not attempt to replay the debate on the need for a Public Accounts Committee, other than, of course, to reject the Chief Minister's counter-arguments, if you could call them that. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, I found his new role as self-proclaimed defender of heads of department somewhat at odds with the ticking off he gave them on the 9th of December 2015 as to overspending in the fourth quarter. Mr. Speaker, let me demonstrate that although we may have had more meetings of this House, we are simply not getting answers to our questions in the way the public might expect. Let me start by way of example with this famous government-owned company called GAR Limited. Mr. Speaker, from GAR Limited, from the transactions I have identified, has purchased somewhere in the order of at least £124 million of property from either government-owned companies or the government, with absolutely no explanation as to where it got the money from or why it is doing this. GAR Limited, Mr. Speaker, has, as far as I can tell, no mortgages charged against it, at least from the last search I conducted, from any leading bank that we know of, and so we can only assume it has borrowed the money from another government-owned company, such as Gibraltar Investment Holdings, or indeed the infamous pool. Now, Mr. Speaker, in relation to one specific transaction, the £40 million purchase of property, including number 6 and the Main Street Post Office, and the question as to where the money for this came from, this is the answer the Chief Minister actually gave. I quote from Hansard, "Mr. Speaker, I do not have the detail of where Gar obtained the money from. The Honourable Gentleman is right in that it is one of the constituent elements of the question, but I do not have the detail in the answer of where Gar obtained the money from. I assume it has either been dealt with by way of intercompany loans or has been dealt with from own funds of Gar." Now, Mr. Speaker, how is that a useful answer to a direct question? The audited accounts of credit finance, Mr. Speaker, are not yet available, despite its creation over 5 years ago. But, Mr. Speaker, even if the accounts were available and audited and filed at the Companies House, the government will not provide the opposition with full information. Mr. Speaker, this is the answer to a recent written question I tabled. And I quote, "Can the government please provide a full copy of the accounts and associated notes of Gibraltar Strand Property Company Limited as at the 31st of March 2014, given that its balance sheet has been filed at Companies House on the 23rd of May 2016. The answer, Mr. Speaker, from the government, no. Government only provides the information that the company is legally required to publish. So, Mr. Speaker, what is the opposition here to do? The opposition's ability to scrutinize government companies is, in fact, no better than the general public's. Mr. Speaker, how then can we hold the government to account when so much of its activity is deliberately structured and financed through government-owned companies? And these are even outside the remit of the principal auditor. How can we, in fact, know the true level of this community's indebtedness or otherwise at all? Mr. Speaker, this is not transparency. It is simply obstruction, and it is contrary to the way our public finances should be conducted. Mr. Speaker, let me turn now to advanced budget measures, the forecast outturn, and the cost of living. Mr. Speaker, traditionally, increases in taxation, whether direct or indirect, are announced as part of the budget session. Mr. Speaker, this government has seen fit to increase social insurance by 10% outside the budget. And there have been increases in level of fees across the board, from car park rentals to MOT fees and other licenses, and new fees introduced, such as the approved contractor annual fee. These are all borne by all and sundry, effectively a form of taxation, and conveniently sidestepped in the Chief Minister's budget speech. Mr. Speaker, we did not hear of one taxation in terms of the individual consumer other than import duties. Mr. Speaker, the government's larger than expected surplus is entirely due to revenue being 63 million greater than expected. This can be broken down as 35 million more in taxes, especially corporation tax, and 14 million more in duty, namely import duty. Now, Mr. Speaker, in a post-Brexit environment, I truly hesitate to suggest that this growth in income is sustainable. And note that the estimate of revenue in 2018 is more conservative, but still higher than estimated in 2016. And I note that the Chief Minister this morning referred to a reduction in tax arrears and having collected 1/5 of tax arrears. From the information I can see in the Principal Auditor's report, that should equate to at least £6 million. So that corporation tax 35 million and general taxes at least 6 million of that is in respect of arrears. But, Mr. Speaker, I won't be ungenerous. We again have to congratulate the Financial Secretary for having kept net, when I say net, departmental expenditure within 1% of the 2016 estimate, albeit it was still an overspent of £6.6 million. Now, Mr. Speaker, in regard to the estimate book for 2017-18, I would ask for an explanation as to why the brought forward consolidated fund balance, as at the 1st of April 2016, is 84.7 million versus last year's closing balance of 80.9 million at the 31st of March, a difference of some £3.8 million. I'd also like to know why, for the actual public debt charge in 15-16, there is no sinking fund contribution, whereas as late as last year's outturn, we expected a 4.5 million contribution. Mr. Speaker, why was it that the interest in government debentures was so incorrectly estimated in 15-16 as 7 million, when the actual turned out to be 11.6 million? Surely the government knows how much interest it is charging itself, since it holds them through the savings bank. Now, Mr. Speaker, it really would be truly remiss of me not to congratulate the Honourable Lady, the Minister for Housing, for her department's hard work in recovering 1 million in rent arrears. However, Mr. Speaker, that regretfully only partially offsets the sins of the Minister for Culture, who again overspent on the music festival, this time, Mr. Speaker, by 1.6 million. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Culture's department at 40% had the largest overspend rate of all government departments. Let's see if MTV can do better, and I would encourage Mr. Bolsano to have a look at the Ministry of Culture as well. Now, Mr. Speaker, in respect of the Improvement and Development Fund, I can only see 45 million as being allocated for capital projects in 2017-18. And Mr. Speaker, the bulk of this, being 28.6 million, is in respect of MOD relocation costs and the tunnel project. Mr. Speaker, I do not see the cost for building new schools. I don't see the cost for building the sewage treatment plant. I don't see, Mr. Speaker, the cost of building a national theatre. But then, Mr. Speaker, I guess there's still life left in this Parliament for the government still to build these and meet its manifesto commitments. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues will speak more about these projects. Now, Mr. Speaker, the budget session, for most people, is about how it will affect their pocket directly. It's not about GDP or national debt levels or who did what, when, and how. Mr. Speaker, at the last measure, inflation is running at 2.7%. And this was confirmed by the Chief Minister this morning, and also in addition by the Honourable Mr. Bolsano. Mr. Speaker, the public sector pay rise this year of 2.75% will deliver a real pay rise of only 0.05%, as opposed to last year's real increase of 2.25%, with inflation at 0.5%. Mr. Speaker, workers in government rental accommodation are also facing a 3% rise in rent and across-the-board increase in fees for licenses and other government services. With the increase in social insurance of 10% already having been implemented, workers will be feeling the pinch very soon. And in the absence of any real tax breaks, we didn't hear anything this morning which translated to anything substantial, which they might expect to be entitled to if the government is reporting such huge surpluses. Mr. Speaker, trickle-down economics. Give the workers their refund. With such a large surplus, workers are also entitled to expect their tax rebates to be paid on time and not when the government feels like it. It is only fair.
Hear, hear, hear.
I'll give an opportunity to. Mr. Speaker. If I may move on, Mr. Speaker, to the Gibraltar Savings Bank and the issue of rainy day funds. Mr. Speaker, the government and the Honourable Mr. Bolsano boast of the great success of the Gibraltar Savings Bank in attracting deposits and generating profits. and accumulating rainy day reserves. But let me dispel part of that as being another piece of financial alchemy. First of all, Mr. Speaker, let me explain how the savings bank has been able to generate surpluses. Close to 70% of all the assets the savings bank holds are either invested in government debt, companies, or other entities. As at the 31st of March, the entire 247 million gross debt of government debentures is held by the savings bank, and he pays on average 6%. And credit finance's 400 million of preference shares yielded an average of 5.6%. Credit finance, in turn, is receiving 6.5% for the money it lent to Gibraltar Investment Holdings. On-call bank accounts, including a 69.5 million deposit at the Gibraltar International Bank, yielded a paltry 0.2%, and listed bonds 0.8%. Mr. Speaker, so the majority of the income of the savings bank is de facto controlled and determined by the government. The government pays the most 5% in the debentures, and recently has dropped the rates in new debenture issues and ordinary accounts. And it pays itself hardly nothing, or hardly anything, on government monies held on on-call accounts. And thus, Mr. Speaker, it can make as much or as little surplus in the savings bank as it wishes. It's not rocket science, or even financial genius, worthy of the Nobel Prize in Economics. It's simple accounting and sleight of hand. What I will not dispute, Mr. Speaker, is that as at the 31st of March 2017, the savings bank is expected to report a surplus of 5.9 million for that year, which is lower than the 6.8 million in 2016, and record an accumulated surplus of 32 million pounds. But although a reserve is of course available for use by the government in future. And that is, in fact, a true rainy day fund. Mr. Speaker, the government may boast that the savings bank deposit base has grown from 987 million in 2016 to 1.3 billion in 2017, which I'm surprised they haven't used the statistic, a 33% increase. But, Mr. Speaker, what the government has not said is that government deposits in the savings bank in that period grew by 241.6 million from 77.6 million to 319.2 million, held in the on-call investment accounts at the savings bank, effectively the famous cash pool. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you strip that out, non-government deposits have grown from 909 million to 995 million, or 9.5%, which is perhaps not a disrespectful growth in deposits, but certainly not 33%. And Mr. Speaker, where did the government find 241 million in 16-17 in 1 year? Could it be, Mr. Speaker, that the net proceeds of the 300 million mortgage of the 6 housing estates, which we understand was concluded in May 2016, has been added to the Treasury cash pool at the savings bank? Well, Mr. Speaker, that would be my guess. And so the growth in deposits of the savings bank, Mr. Speaker, there's nothing to boast about, given that the origin of the money is simply more indirect borrowing. Mr. Speaker, I again urge the government to release the audited accounts of the savings bank on a timely basis. The Honourable Mr. Bolzano has had the audited accounts for 2016 and yet inexplicably refuses to publish them in the Gazette. Mr. Speaker, I have tried to amend the legislation to ensure a more reasonable timetable for publication, but the government, following its policy of transparency, voted against this. And Mr. Speaker, when Mr. Bolzano sends out his glossy publication, albeit for outdated accounts, to his account holders, he has admitted today, fails to include the statement of investments, showing how the money is used. Now, he tells me this in this House that he provides it to me. Well, why doesn't he provide it to them too? I don't see what the issue is. And Mr. Speaker, this is not transparency in any shape or form. It is the control of information by a government whose dogma is strict financial secrecy, Mr. Speaker. This is not transparency.
Here are a couple of fools answering an argument that was not posted.
Was the Chief Minister quite finished?
No, I was saying that here's a couple of fools who are answering an argument that has not been put to them. Shall I say it again?
Please, yes. Say for the public to hear. Mr. Speaker, he's calling us fools. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the other favourite rainy day fund of the Honourable Mr. Bossano, namely community care. Mr. Speaker, I have in the past disputed whether this can actually be called a rainy day fund, as it is not technically in the control of the government. Now, Mr. Speaker, according to the GSLP Liberal Manifesto at the last election, the reserves of community care stood at 100 million at March 2015. Mr. Speaker, in 5 years to 2020, they claimed that would reach 230 million, and I think it has been repeated today. Mr. Speaker, for the past 2 years, a total of 40 million has been given by the Consolidated Fund to community care, and for this coming year, another 20 million is projected. Now, Mr. Speaker, from the estimates book in prior years, the annual cost of community care is around 16 million a year, and I'm happy to be corrected by the Honourable Mr. Bossano. So on a best guess, with a surplus of maybe 4 million a year on this level of contribution, I can only see community care achieving a reserve of maybe 120 to 130 million by 2020. To achieve 230 million, either the government will have to gift 100 million of the Consolidated Fund's reserves just before the general election, or perhaps, Mr. Speaker, the trustees can turn 100 million into 200 million in 5 years by judicious investment. And Mr. Speaker, I sincerely hope that this large amount of money is not also being directed to support government capital projects or companies. Because, Mr. Speaker, if it is, and Gibraltar suddenly needs the money, it may not be readily available. I would welcome, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Chief Minister will respond, I welcome, Mr. Speaker, the government's thoughts on the future funding of community care, and indeed any information on how that money is invested and managed for the people of Gibraltar. Mr. Speaker, inwards investment. Mr. Speaker, we have yet to see any major projects come to fruition. We were told about the East Side Blue Water project to much fanfare in June 2015, only for it to have gone very, very quiet, Mr. Speaker, and no sign of the promised 83 million premium from the developer. I repeat, 83 million, Chief Minister. Nothing happened, Mr. Speaker. Nothing happened. Last year, the Chief Minister teased us with an exciting reclamation project at Coaling Island. Mr. Speaker, nothing happened. And now we hear this morning that we, the people of Gibraltar, using the money from mortgaging the housing estates, are in fact going to be partly financing that development. Mr. Speaker, inwards investment from our own money. And of course, Mr. Speaker, that famous word we all so love in this House, the government will make an announcement shortly. I wouldn't hold your breath, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we heard of the Finance Centre lunch in London in October 2015, that London and Regional were the preferred bidder to develop the Rook site. And Mr. Speaker, nothing happened. In his New Year's address this year, the Chief Minister said, and I quote, "Many other young people will be very happy to hear that you will soon be receiving," soon I guess same as shortly, "letters to start the process of purchasing new affordable homes at Bob Palisa Mews and Centenary Terraces." Mr. Speaker, yes, Mr. Speaker, nothing happened. Nothing happened. And Mr. Speaker, talking about nothing, I was surprised not to hear of a boast from the Chief Minister in his budget address about Bob Belisa Mews or Sanson Centenary Terraces. Or is it, Mr. Speaker, that nothing's going to happen on those either? Mr. Speaker, I truly appreciate that attracting inward investment is difficult, especially in this post-Brexit environment. And I will, of course, support all efforts in that regard. However, I would ask that we, as politicians, albeit myself a novice in the eyes of that side of the House, refrain from making announcements until the ink is dry on the agreement and the money is in the bank. Mr. Speaker, in an uncertain age, our people want to hear about certainty and not imaginary projects. We don't want to hear shortly. People want to hear what is going to happen. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would encourage the Chief Minister to, in his response, explain to the people of Gibraltar what is happening with Bob Belisa Mews and our Sanson Centenary Terraces. Turning to small businesses, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've heard the Honourable Dr. John Goldes, the Minister for Education, on 2 recent occasions, encourage our students to look to the private sector and not the public sector for future employment. Mr. Speaker, the government is quite rightly identifying the private sector as the true driver of employment and wealth creation. And for that, I congratulate the Minister. But, Mr. Speaker, in this regard, in order to encourage innovation and the entrepreneurs of the future, we need to make starting a business as easy as possible. I know that the Honourable Mr. Costa tried his best to reform business licensing, but this needs simplification, especially as regards the business premises requirement. Now, I know the Gibraltar Federation of Small Businesses and the Chamber are working closely with the government on this matter, and I hope progress will be made soon. And, Mr. Speaker, the cost of renting premises and stores, I am told, is understandably a huge business cost for startups. And again, I would welcome any plans by the government in this regard. Mr. Speaker, turning to financial services. Mr. Speaker, during the year, we've seen new legislation brought to this House in respect of foundations, which I welcomed at the time, and I still do. But we need to continue to evolve our product offering so as to keep pace with our clients' needs and, indeed, competitors in other jurisdictions. Mr. Speaker, I've noted the government's support for the development of Gibraltar as a fintech hub and the Joint Government and Financial Services Commission consultation paper entitled Proposals for a Distributed Ledger Technology DLT Regulatory Framework. A bit of a mouthful. And I don't know if everybody actually understands what it means, but it sounds good. This also I am happy to support. But, Mr. Speaker, with the proviso that the risk is correctly identified and managed so there can be no reputational damage to a jurisdiction. And I'm sure the Minister understands that point. Mr. Speaker, along with, I'm sure, with all the members of this House, lament the departure of the Newcastle Building Society and indeed other job losses in the banking sector. But speaking from experience, I can say that this is in fact a worldwide problem and not a Gibraltar-specific issue, as the banks continue to retrench and preserve capital after the 2008 financial crisis. But, Mr. Speaker, this is not to say that we should resign ourselves to the risk of being unbanked. We need to encourage existing retail banking operators not just to stay, Mr. Speaker, but to expand their offering where possible. Mr. Speaker, the Gibraltar International Bank continues to fill the gap left by loss of Barclays, and I look forward to seeing their full financial statements for the 31st of March 2016, and not just the highlights picked out by the Minister. This bank needs to be a success, not just for the sake of the business community, but for the community as a whole. It has to be a safe place for our savings and a source of financing for mortgages and loans, which are the lifeblood of any thriving economy. I would ask the Minister, who I know will be speaking shortly, if he could explain why the bank has undergone a recent capital restructuring such that it has converted its ordinary shares into two different classes of shares, A shares and B shares, with the B shares having no voting rights. And it would seem to indicate to me there might be some intention to place the B shares. I'm asking the Minister because the shareholders' resolution was in fact signed by the Chief Secretary on the 25th of April this year. And I would welcome any thoughts from the Minister as to what it is that the government intends in regards to the shareholding of the International Bank, seeing it is the sole shareholder. And Mr. Speaker, I again thank the board and the staff of the bank for their efforts, and I of course wish them well. Mr. Speaker, as regards the financial services regulation, I still await news as to the rewrite of our financial services legislation, especially in light of Brexit. It will no doubt be an interesting debate when Gibraltar considers its own great repeal bill, and what should be kept and what should be discarded, while of course preserving the highest possible standard of regulation and remaining best in class. Mr. Speaker, also pending is the appointment of a financial services ombudsman, and I look forward to hearing more on this matter from the Minister. Mr. Speaker, financial services is an important pillar of our economy, and we need not only to protect it in a post-Brexit environment, but also to grow it in a way that encourages new players to set up in Gibraltar, and in this regard, Mr. Speaker, the government has my full support. Turning now to heritage, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the achievement of World Heritage status for Gorham's Cave was a truly remarkable achievement and a credit to all those who promoted the project, not least Professor Clive Finlayson. Mr. Speaker, we should not underestimate the importance of both our natural and historical heritage for our people and visitors alike. Mr. Speaker, I have long felt our social history has been somewhat neglected, all too often in favour of military history. I'm pleased to see the Deputy Chief Minister's initiative in that the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum is being remembered and celebrated. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, I missed it by 5 days. It is important, Mr. Speaker, that future generations are taught the importance of that day, and not just once a year, but in classrooms as part of their education. Mr. Speaker, to this end, I would like to see the government encouraging more young people to take an interest in our rich heritage, whether in schools or in partnership with Heritage Trust. Mr. Speaker, there are still many heritage projects to be completed, such as the Northern Defences, which I know the Deputy Chief Minister has spoken on already, and others to be started, such as the Murrish Castle complex. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, the importance of these sites is well understood, and I'm sure will be well protected. And last but not least, Mr. Speaker, I would welcome the long overdue Heritage and Antiquities Act, especially with regard to revised listing of protected buildings, and I would be grateful if the Minister in his address could give an indication as to when he proposes to bring the bill to this House. And so, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, as I've said in my opening, the numbers never lie. But it's much too easy for this government to distort and hide the real numbers. I regret, Mr. Speaker, that I have grave reservations as to what reliance can be placed on the completeness of the information in the estimates book and thus the appropriation bill for 1718. And for the reasons of lack of transparency as to the financial state activities and accounting for debt of government-owned companies, I simply cannot support this bill. And Mr. Speaker, I again call for the Chief Minister to give up the portfolio of Finance Minister and allocate this to another minister, perhaps to his left. It is not healthy for the CEO to also wear the hat of finance director. There always needs to be a tension between the two to guarantee financial prudence. Mr. Speaker, we as a community, we need to be prepared for the unexpected as much as we can in this post-Brexit world. I'm confident that we as a people will find a way to succeed no matter what the odds. But, Mr. Speaker, we must keep a close eye on the public purse, and indeed those that control the purse strings. Mr. Speaker, that being as it may, the watchword, and we've heard this word many times today, the watchword is prudence, not austerity, as the government would have the people believe the opposition advocate, which we don't. Mr. Speaker, prudence in planning for the future in this uncertain world, and prudence and transparency in our public finances at all times. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.